Hello, I see General Ramesh Chopra. Good evening. Yeah, Marshal Patni. Good evening. Yeah, Marshal Naresh Verma. We
Good
have
evening,
Ambassador
Surendra ji. Good evening.
Salvis. Good evening.
Pleasure to join.
Hi, Naresh. Good evening.
Welcome,
Good evening,
welcome,
sir. How are you, sir?
welcome, welcome.
Hi, Naresh. Hi, Surendra. Good evening.
Good evening, sir. Good evening. Hi, my friend from Jaipur. Kumawatji, how are you? Hi, Ravi. How are you? Ravi, good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Fine. Did you have your coffee?
I'm drinking it right now. But thank you
I'm
for having me,
sorry.
Ambassador
I'm
Kumar.
sorry because of time difference. For you, it's too early. For us, it is evening time.
No, it's actually perfect for me. We're almost at the end of winter, so our days are beginning earlier. The weather's improving. It's nice to wake up
Yeah, yeah.
early.
No, good to see you because we keep on reading about you and good to connect with you. And you have been there for now 6 months, isn't it? Less than 6 months.
In
As
this role as editor-in-chief, yes, but I've been
yeah,
at foreign policy for 3 years.
earlier you were the managing director, yes, managing editor, yes. So we are all very proud that somebody like you, such young age, you occupy such a very important assignment and a very prestigious publication for 50 years, celebrated 50 years, isn't it?
That's right. I actually have our print magazine in front of us, 50 years.
Oh, I see. So you and foreign affairs are in competition.
We are, in a very healthy way. I mean, the main difference between us and foreign affairs is that we also do some news. So
Yeah,
foreign affairs publishes maybe 10 to 12 essays a week. We
yeah.
publish around 50, but that includes some news pieces. We're a little bit more accessible than foreign affairs
Okay.
is.
Mm-hmm. I think what I would suggest, we will begin on dots because our friend keep on joining because this is like free flowing. There's like a walk in, walk out. We have no
Right.
control on friends, but I'm sure after 10 minutes, the almost house is always full. And somebody is already raising hand to ask questions. We have not even begun.
Excellent.
Come prepared to ask questions. That will be in the end. So, uh, and how was the press conference of the president?
I thought it was very uneventful, which is a good thing. The questions were surprisingly didn't include any on the coronavirus, but
But
it
he
was
didn't
just
have any combating fight with the journalists like Donald Trump used to have.
no, which is a relief, honestly. I think the media ecosystem here also needs to recalibrate in terms of what its
Yeah.
role is. And what it needs to get out of these press conferences.
Yes. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Welcome to another virtual conversation, discussion of IAFA. And we are very proud, honored to have a very young colleague, a friend of ours, Ravi Agrawal, who is now editor-in-chief of Foreign Affairs. He was earlier managing editor. He's no stranger to India. He has been CNN bureau chief in India, and he has. Please keep your audios on mute. I have done it, all of them, except when Ravi will speak, he can really change it. Now, before joining FE, Agrawal worked on CNN for more than a decade, a full-time role spanning 3 continents, including as the network's New Delhi bureau chief and correspondent. Agrawal has shared a Peabody Award and 3 Emmy nominations for his work as TV producer and his writing for foreign policy. Was part of a series nominated for 2020 National Magazine Award for columns and commentary. Ravi is author of India Connected, How the Smartphone is Transforming World's Largest Democracy. He is a graduate of the Harvard University, which I don't have any connection, but my son-in-law passed out of Harvard, so we have some connection there. Well, Ravi, we have a lot of area to cover. So I will shoot up questions. You are free to not to answer, whichever you don't want to, and be brief, then we can cover more. Now, first question will be, as you know, President Biden has asserted America is back. Now, could you please deconstruct, demystify, decipher this phrase? How will it affect the lives of Americans, and how will it impact America's foreign policy? Here you go.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think, using the phrase America's back is very important because it sort of creates a line, it draws a line in the sand between the Biden presidency and the Trump presidency. As we know, one of the things that Donald Trump really changed with American foreign policy was to retreat, was to very clearly say, we don't want to have anything to do with these foreign wars. We don't want to have alliances in which we are not gaining. So every alliance, every treaty is a zero-sum game. We want to make sure we have, when it comes to trade, we shouldn't have any deficits. We don't want to be a part of larger deals such as the Paris Climate Accords. We want to make sure that other countries are paying more for NATO, so on and so forth. A very transactional approach to foreign policy. I think what has been very important for the Biden administration in its early days, when it comes to foreign policy, is to really be able to tell the world the old America is back. The America of the Obama era, of the Clinton era, even the Bush era, where America stands for a certain set of values, whatever those values are, and we can criticize them and get into them later. But America stands for human rights and democracy. America stands for certain types of alliances. Essentially, it sees itself as the leader of the liberal world order, however you define that. But to do so, it was very important for Biden to message to leaders in Europe, to message to his counterparts in Canada, across Latin America, in other parts of the world, the Quad countries, for example, that America is not going to be purely transactional, that America also has its values in mind, and not just its interests. So that's one way of defining and looking at what the phrase America is back means. I think the other lens through which to really look at Biden's foreign policy is domestic policy. He's been very clear that he is going to create a foreign policy for the middle class. And what that really means, and we're still figuring out the contours of what that means, but in the early days, what is very clear is that he has not done much on foreign policy so far. He's sitting tight. He's sort of keeping his powder dry when it comes to giant clashes. There's no grand Middle East plan. Obviously, there were meetings with the Chinese in Alaska. There were the Quad meetings. But by and by, it's a softly approach, which is to say that his first priority is the middle class at home, is getting jabs and arms, so vaccines, is ensuring, his big focus was the stimulus, the $1.9 trillion stimulus. That's the America he's talking about, an America that can speak to the world from a position of strength at home. I think that's what he means by America is back.
Okay, you saw President having the first press conference of presidency last night, last evening, morning, for depend which time zone you are. Now he said, I have been elected to solve problems and not to divide the nation. Now we all know Trump is gone, but Trumpism alive and kicking. Millions of supporters, there are more than 71 million. How will Biden address this phenomenon?
This is a tough one. I think there are two sides to this equation. So on the one hand, I think with all of the calls he's having with leaders, I think the question he often receives is, okay, fine, we'll deal with you for the next 3 or 4 years. What happens after that? What happens if the Republicans are back in power? What happens if Trump is back in power? Then all of these deals and alliances you're stitching together, we can't trust you. He doesn't have a great answer for that because there isn't one. At home, I think he's biding for time. I think ultimately that's what it is. he needs time to see if the measures that he's putting in place can move the needle. I think if you look at all the policies he's pushed in the early days of his presidency, they are in fact broadly popular. So it is widely popular to really push hard to get vaccinations to regular Americans. And he upped his promise from 100 million in 100 days to 200 million in 100 days, which is, by far and away the most in the world. If you look at his $1.9 trillion stimulus plan, despite the fact that the Republican Party pushed hard against it and argued against it in Congress, it is a broadly popular plan on the left and the right, in large part because many of the people receiving the stimulus checks are also on the right. I think that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to push policies that appeal to a broad majority of the country, and in doing so, get a chance to prove to Americans that he's not thinking purely in terms of left and right. He's thinking in terms of the American middle class. My sense is that that is his strategy. Beyond that, it's hard to figure out how you can really unite America. It's hard to figure out how you can depolarize, what is this incredibly polarized country. And that's in large part because, the American electorate system is not a symmetrical system. It is not one in which the most votes wins, in part because of gerrymandering, in part because of the Electoral College. It is not one in which truth always matters. This is a country, in some senses, like India. America and India have many similarities, but America is rife with disinformation. If you switch on Fox News at any evening when the opinion shows come on, it is Fantasyland. And this is not, I'm not a lefty who's pointing out that Fox is Fantasyland. It is Fantasyland. It is not factual. It is counter programming. It is basically the opposition programming. That is dangerous for American democracy. It is dangerous in that it solidifies the right, and it solidifies people who believe in Trumpism to a certain extent. With all of those things, it's very hard to see how Biden can really knit the left and the right together. And remember, the other thing here is that Biden faces pressure not just from his right, but also from his left. He has a progressive wing of the Democratic Party, which wants him to do much more. They want him to install a cabinet that is far more diverse than the most diverse cabinet in American history. They want Biden to be far more progressive when it comes to taxation, when it comes to immigration, when it comes to a range of domestic issues, when it comes to the minimum wage. So Biden has constraints both on the left and on the right, and I don't envy him. What he has to do in the next couple of years is to walk a very tight path, and ultimately, if you want to get a sense of what he's going to do, I would think not of the left and right, but think of what a majority of Americans want. That is a good way to decipher what Biden might do next. So basically, look at the polls, look at what most Americans seem to want. Most Americans do want stimulus. That's why you'll get more stimulus.
Okay, thank you, Ravi. Now, look, the views of the neighbors matter. Now, America has two neighbors, Mexico and Canada. Do you think they are breathing easy now that Trump is out of White House? But for the last 2-3 days, if you see the press report about thousands of Mexicans coming on the border, it is attracting quite a lot of critical comment about Biden's administration.
Yeah, that's right. So I'll leave aside the immigration issue for a second. But broadly, I do think Canada and Mexico will be breathing easily. I think Trudeau in Canada did not have a good relationship with Trump. It is very telling that Biden's first, a meeting with a foreign leader, not a phone call, but the first real meeting was with Trudeau. And I think that goes to show the historic partnership between Canada and the United States, the alignment that the two countries share, despite a range of difficulties. There are things that Biden and Trudeau disagree on, and yet this was a very cordial call. You could see the relief on the Canadian side. Mexico is trickier. I think, on the one hand, Mexicans were abused in a variety of ways by Trump. You know, the things he said, rapists coming across the border. Um, but if you look at it outside of just the pure immigration lens, you know, the US-Mexico relationship is a very interesting one. I mean, ultimately, the Mexican economy is tanking right now. And I think so the way to examine that relationship is mostly through a domestic Mexican lens, which is worrying, to say the least, at this moment. They're also struggling with the coronavirus. They will be hoping to get vaccines from the United States. So some vaccine diplomacy may help in the coming months. But the immigration issue is a different one. It is clear that across Central America and South America, people feel that Biden would be more lenient. And that's why we're seeing droves of people try to come and cross the border. This is both a good thing and a bad thing. It's a good thing in that you want people to come to America. You want people to want to come to America. That, after all, is American soft power. That is the reason why America can call itself great, is that, you know, you take a straw poll of people around the world, and a lot of people are going to want to come to America. That speaks well of the United States under Biden. I think Biden realizes, however, it does him no good to have droves of, you know, young migrants waiting at the border, put up in detention facilities. It's a recipe for disaster, especially if there are unaccompanied minors. I mean, that, after all, was a major controversy for the Trump administration. So Biden has now earmarked Vice President Kamala Harris to focus on this issue, you know, and try and make sure that there's some halfway house of either, you know, some of the migrants being stopped in Mexico. There is the Northern Triangle, including Guatemala and Honduras, to try and ensure that there's more economic development there so that fewer migrants would want to leave in the first place. But all of this is a murky issue. It is made worse, again, by the fact that Fox News is broadcasting live from the border every day and making a bigger deal of it than it is. But for me, you know, the biggest immigration story is actually the immediate revocation of the so-called Trump Muslim ban through executive order. You know, on day one, to basically say all of the people in these, I think it's 13 countries, including Nigeria, but mostly Muslim majority countries, to just say, no, we're not going to ban people from your country to come here, which is so important in terms of what it means for those countries, what it means for, you know, Nigerian Americans, Myanmarese Americans, Sudanese Americans, for them to be able to say, you know, I can now have my parents come join me in America, or I can have my sister come visit me in America. Yeah. That is really important.
Okay, Ravi, now let's move to Europe, because they have been the closest allies of the United States. Now, Biden said his main objective is strengthening alliances. What concrete measures he can take to reach out to European Union? While NATO allies might not have liked Trump's blunt demand to contribute more to their defense, most Americans believe that he was right. So will Biden embrace Trump's policy toward the European Union and NATO, but execute it in a more diplomatic and nuanced manner?
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head. I think, you know, this is one of the strange things about Trump, where so much of what he did was blatantly wrong, but there was often a kernel of truth, some small, tiny kernel of truth to some of the things he said. And so it is with the NATO issue. I think when Trump would point out that NATO allies weren't contributing enough, or, you know, I believe the 2% of GDP threshold, he did have a point. And I think that's something, in a sense, by sort of ripping that bandage off for much of the American foreign policy establishment, he may have actually made it easier, because some contributions have increased over the last few years. And this puts Biden in a better position to not have to talk about that so much, and instead to really focus on boosting US sentiments in Europe, And instead, I think that the main thing that would have changed between 4 years ago and now is China when it comes to Europe. Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, was in Brussels this week, and he was at a NATO gathering, and he spoke quite clearly about the fact that the US and the European Union would have to coordinate on China policy. European leaders are across the board growing increasingly suspicious of Beijing. And they're very wary of, what could end up being a prolonged struggle between Brussels and its top trading partner, Beijing. Look at Angela Merkel, for example, the German chancellor. She's, for several years now, focused more on teasing out economic synergies with China rather than focusing on Europe's systemic rivalry with China. Given all of those things, I think the role that Washington can play in Brussels is now only more important, because in sort of positioning China as more of not just a challenge, but as more of a threat, it may be able to knit together its European allies in a way that wouldn't have been so easy before. Think of the cooperation on intelligence, the Five Eyes, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the UK, and the US. Put together, the intelligence that they could share ultimately will become a thorn in China's side. Getting democracies on deck, to use Blinken's words this week, again sort of puts the EU and the US on one side and China on another. So I think those are some areas in which we'll see Washington try and renew and reorient its relationship with Europe, mostly through democracy, through human rights. And then let's not forget climate change. I think European countries are very focused on climate change. It is not just necessary policy for them, it is also popular policy. Populations there are increasingly focused on what their countries are doing to boost green energy. And I'm convinced that Secretary Kerry, who is the new climate envoy for the United States, will do a lot to boost relations with European countries using climate issues as a bulwark to stand on.
Let's move to his interim national security strategic guidance speech, which he made. Biden has emphasized his intent to pursue multilateralism, which would be a welcome departure from his predecessors' unpredictable, unsettling unilateralism. But stitching together a multilateral coalition alone doesn't necessarily produce desired result. If eventual goals are not clear and an exit plan is not being thought through, we have seen it happening in Afghanistan. We have seen it happening in Iraq. Do you think Biden's multilateralism should be taken on the face value?
Yeah, that's a that's a very good question. I think we'll need more time to see how Biden's multilateralism will play out. But I think even so, if you examine the way in which he's handling Afghanistan, the approach he's taken so far, even when it comes to Afghanistan, even though it's such early days, suggests that his promise to sort of use allies where possible is not so far seeming to be an empty promise. With Afghanistan, the way in which, the talks have obviously included the likes of Pakistan, they've included India as well. There's a real sense that, this is, on the one hand, the United States needs to get out of there, but on the other hand, the reason why it's not doing that immediately is because, the Afghan problem could easily metastasize into a regional problem. And I think it needs a multilateral solution. I think if you look at the real focus on the Quad, for example, which is a grouping that I think has been on the up over the last 2 or 3 U.S. presidencies, but for Biden to give it clear attention in his first 50 days, 60 days, is also a marker for how he sees the importance of multilateralism. And I think ultimately, what is very clear for this administration, it seems to me, is that its main foreign policy issue is China. Interestingly, at the press conference yesterday, one of the questions Biden was asked was, do you agree with President Obama when he said that North Korea is America's biggest foreign policy problem? And Biden said in one word, yes. Many people have misinterpreted this to think that North Korea is America's biggest foreign policy priority. It is not. It is Washington's biggest problem, in that Kim Jong-un is a highly unpredictable, intractable figure who cannot be pressured from below or above, who seemingly doesn't have the best interests of his own people in mind, so sanctions can have limited effect. He's a dynast. It's very difficult to figure out how to deal with a character like this, who is seemingly immune to pressure, and often seemingly irrational. That's why he termed it as a problem. But if you look at priorities, it is very clear that this administration's greatest foreign policy priority is China. And the only way to deal with China, the only way to boost oneself against China, is to stitch together alliances. And I think that would be the lens through which to examine Biden's commitment to multilateralism. And when it comes to the Quad, when it comes to relations with Europe, when it comes to Africa and the Middle East as an arena, I think we must always keep China in mind in the coming years.
Well, Ravi, let us press this subject a little bit more. Some strategic thinkers contend that in today's multipolar world, multilateralism is passe. More and more countries would try to explore bilateral, trilateral, plurilateral, regional solutions as warranted by given situations. It isn't non-alignment to, or no alignment, or multi-alignment. It would mean different arrangements for addressing different issues. In Indian External Affairs Minister Dr. Jaisankar's view, Indian grand strategy in uncertain world requires advancing national interests while identifying and exploiting opportunities created by global contradictions, so as to extract as much gains from as many ties as possible. Do you think this unhinged approach to alliances can contribute to a stable international order?
I don't know. We haven't tried it out. There's really no knowing. It's hard to imagine many of the global systems that we've created, from the IMF to the World Bank to the UN to the WHO to NATO, groups that essentially underpin global diplomacy. It's hard to imagine all of these groups working the way they are without some sense of leadership, without some powers that are stronger than others. If everything was purely transactional, if everything was purely country A dealing with country B in its own interests, I think that form of a highly chaotic world, it may work in a very sort of Adam Smith kind of way, to use an economics term, but it worries me because it's untested. A lot could go wrong. All kinds of disputes could break out, and there wouldn't be the existing mechanisms we have, the post-World War II mechanisms we have to engage and deal with these kinds of issues. So the world that you're describing, the world that Foreign Minister Jaishankar is describing, worries me a little bit. It may happen. I don't know. But what I do know is that the United States will try to delay that for as long as possible. Maybe Trump was not trying to delay that because he didn't want America to be the global policeman. He didn't want America to be stuck with the bill. he viewed the world from a very transactional lens, like a businessman. Biden is not like that. Biden has a much older worldview in the sense of America's role in the world. I think he sees America not as a policeman in terms of the baton and the gun. He sees America more as a moral policeman. And I think that distinction is very important to make, because what it means is that under Biden, I don't really expect America to get embroiled in foreign conflicts or in wars, but I do expect America to get embroiled in foreign affairs. I do expect America to make increasingly tough statements on Xinjiang and China, and to use that as a way with which to knit the world together against China, to create an us and a them, to create a group of allied democracies and non-democracies, to make clearer the difference between democratic leaders and autocrats. That is a difference and a distinction that was eroded during the Trump years. And I think Biden will work very hard to re-establish those distinctions, primarily to re-establish US standing in the world, at least in terms of the way in which he can spin it. We can discuss and debate American history and America's moral right to say these things, but that is what America wants.
Well, we all know America is the oldest democracy. So Biden's desire to stand for democracy, raise a stink about violation of human rights wherever they may be, is understandable. But don't you think the US lacks the moral high ground, having battled with some of the most authoritarian regimes, take for example Egypt or Saudi Arabia, all the Gulf countries, and desperately seeking Kim Jong-un, North Korea, and Taliban Afghanistan? Don't increasing attacks on blacks, which led to the Black Lives Matter, and more than 510 attacks on Asian Americans, 2 shooting incidents in the last 2 weeks, leaving behind more than 2 dozen innocent people dead, armed insurrection on 6 January at the Capitol, underline the fault lines of American society. Some commentators even argue that if the US cares so much for human rights, why should it be trying to strike a deal with Taliban, whose record of human rights is just appalling?
This is a great question. So there's a domestic answer and there's a foreign answer. I'll do the domestic one first. All of these flaws you point out, violence against blacks, violence against Asian Americans, violence on the Capitol, these are facts. This is true. These are flaws within American society. I think the most important thing to understand about America and the way in which Biden is talking about America is that admitting flaws is not a weakness, it is a strength. And I think you will see Biden say this again and again and again, that these flaws exist in America. And the best way to deal with flaws is to openly accept them, to discuss and debate what needs to be done about them, and then to come up with policies. I think America ultimately, while the world has made fun of it in the last year, given the attacks on African Americans, given the recent attacks on Asian Americans, there's no doubt that that has dented American standing. But I think more than that, American standing has been strengthened by the fact that it has owned up to these problems, that there have been mass protests. Black Lives Matter protests last year in America were extensive. And if you look at the video and the images of the people protesting, they were not just blacks protesting, they were a broad coalition of different races and genders getting together and protesting. I think that sends a really strong message. Ultimately, this is what democracy is. Criticizing is not a bad thing. Being able to accept criticism, being able to showcase criticism on all of your TV channels and on the front pages of your newspapers is a strength, not a weakness. It is a feature of democracy. That makes, I think, American democracy stronger. It also is something that I think broadens American soft power. My guess is there are people around the world who see this debate and they look inward and they say, I wish we could have these debates too.
Thank you. Let's move to some economic issues. You remember 2, 3 years back, both Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi were extolling virtues of globalization at the Davos Economic Forum, while Donald Trump was talking about America first. Thanks to devastation caused by world economy by COVID-19, more and more countries are looking inward and drawing shutters. So is globalization, as we have known for 3 decades, is dying? Or have we entered what some observers call the deglobalization or the fractured globalization period?
Yeah, I think, with globalization, it is not just globalization that has created problems in the last decade or so. I think there are some other related trends, and I'll just quickly explain what I mean. Those trends are urbanization. So as more and more people leave rural settings, villages, and move to the cities, what happens then to rural communities? They end up becoming smaller, they end up losing some of their old historic ties, they become economically reliant on urban centers. That's one thing. The unbelievable uptake of technology in the last decade has meant then that people can work remotely. It has meant then that people anywhere in the world can do anything. It has also meant that there is an incredible stress on small businesses, on mom and pop stores in India, your Modi ka dukans. There's a stress on all of these things because, through technology, we have basically strengthened giant conglomerates and supply chains to be able to deliver things in a way in which, if it happened over a century, that's one thing, but this has happened in 5 to 10 years. So technology, urbanization, and now you combine that with globalization. And lastly, unfettered capitalism, in which market forces left uncorrected have ended up doing significant damage to local communities. You add up all of these four trends together, and then you can put together a fairly strong critique of modern globalization in its current form, that it has, to a fair degree, been detrimental to local communities around the world. That is something that needs to be addressed by every country in its own way. Every country in its own way will have to look inward a little bit more, will have to focus on smaller communities, on rural areas, to ensure that the urbanization trend we have seen across the board is decelerated, to ensure that rural communities have a say in how they are governed, to ensure that family units, while they are being torn asunder, that there are also some buffers, to ensure that, for example, with the current work from home trend, to ensure that there isn't too much change too quickly in a way that disrupts society. These are good discussions to have. The mention of Davos, however, is interesting because I think the way Davos is designed is that we all show up in January and we make grand declarative comments. I think for every time Davos has championed capitalism, it has also said that capitalism is ending. And for every time it has championed globalization, it has also at some point said that that deglobalization is occurring and globalization is the problem. So I wouldn't read too much into what leaders say at Davos. And again, keeping in mind, public statements at Davos are mostly designed for a domestic audience back home, not really for the audience at Davos. But broadly, I do think, the world is entering an era now where it has to think hard about the unfettered capitalism and the unfettered globalization of the last 30, 40 years. There's, you all may know of Francis Fukuyama's great book, The End of History and the Last Man. And in this book, he basically at the end of the Cold War, he said that, now that countries around the world all are racing to democratize, basically, because there's this fundamental understanding and belief that this is it. If you have democracy and you have capitalism, what else do you need? You don't need anything else. This is the end of history. We cannot get better than this. And I think Fukuyama now realizes, as all of us do, that that was wrong. Democracy is maybe the best form of governance we have, but it can't function uncorrected. It needs corrections from time to time. Capitalism may be the best form of economic governance that we have, but it too needs checks and balances. It needs to be corrected from time to time. I think that's the general acknowledgement now that economists and governments around the world are coming round to, and something that we will see more discussion of in the coming years. And it will show up in policy making. I mean, if you look at the grand stimulus plan in the United States, $1.9 trillion, which is more than the entire GDP of, at least 185 countries in the world. If you look at something as big as that, you begin to understand that this is essentially not just a stimulus, it is a correction of capitalism. It is an implicit acknowledgement that things aren't working. The system isn't working. Therefore, we need to intervene. I would expect many more interventions in the coming years.
Okay, Ravi, you might not take Davos seriously, but you might take comments of your friend in New York seriously. Both Hari Zakaria and Tom Friedman have been talking about the post-American world. Now, our friend S.D. Tallis, who was in my program some months back, he said, predictions of the end of hegemony of America are grossly premature. What is your stand on this debate? Do you think with $1.9 trillion stimulus plan that you just talked about and lead in cutting edge technology, the US economy will bounce back and stay on the top for the next few decades?
So this is a tough one. I highly respect Ashley Tellis. Fareed is my former boss and also a good friend, so I'm not going to disagree with any of them. Look, the way I see it is, I wouldn't hasten to call the decline of America. I think there is no doubt that in relative terms, America has declined in influence, not just because of its own performance, but because of the unprecedented rise of China. Through that framework, if you look at the unprecedented rise of China, which has never been seen in the history of the world, for one economy to rise up so quickly, to basically eliminate poverty, double-digit growth for 3 to 4 decades, immense accumulation of wealth, technology, and and power and resources. This has never been seen, and so that is the lens through which to examine American relative decline, not just hard decline, but relative decline. If you look at it that way, I think it's clear that the American era of pure hegemony, so the era post-Cold War up to about 2010, that 30-year span where America was the clear, unrivaled superpower, that is indeed gone. Does that mean that it is the end of America? No, I think American power, American soft power, will endure for pretty much all of our lifetimes. And I think that is because several reasons. One is that, as I said, America's decline is relative. America is still growing as an economy. America is still immensely seductive as a soft power. I think the way in which it's knitting together alliances and trying to sort of create a forum of democracies versus a forum of autocracies, it shows the enduring appeal of America, the enduring appeal of democracy, the enduring appeal of human rights. And finally, I'm not sure what China really wants. I'm not sure that China wants to be an unrivaled superpower. It's unclear to me where the Chinese see themselves going 50 years from now, whether they plan to use their increasing heft and influence outside their borders in terms of acquisitions or in terms of purely just being a stronger power. That's hard to say. You may have heard of the Thucydides principle, which is basically which comes from Sparta, which is this theory that every time there is one superpower and another rising superpower, there's bound to be a war, which is basically, the superpower will see the rising power necessarily as a threat and will pick a fight with it, which is what happened in Sparta. That scenario may play out. I'm not entirely sure, but I would sort of calibrate myself between the people you mentioned, between Tom Friedman and Ashley Tellis. I think America is declining in relative terms, too soon to call its end.
Okay. By joining Paris Climate Accord on the very first day of presidency and holding the first virtual summit of Quad in less than 2 months and pushing it to adopt a more holistic and positive approach by unifying effort to produce 1 billion vaccine for Southeast Asian countries, cooperating on new technologies and putting together secure supply chains away from anti-China slant, which Russia accused it of, and not highlighting security defense aspect, which were the main goals of Quad in the beginning. Biden is leading from the front and regaining America's global leadership role. Is that a fair assessment?
To some extent, I think it's still too soon to see to say that declaratively. Biden had during the Obama years, the New Yorker once described Obama's foreign policy as leading from behind. And this was a phrase that was attributed to a source within the Obama administration. I don't think we ever discovered who the source was, but the assumption was that it was Ben Rhodes, who was Obama's speechwriter and one of his foreign policy confidants. I don't think Biden will want to lead from the front, as it were. I think he would. Some of what he is doing is a correction of the Trump years, and we must see it through that lens of a correction. Rejoining the Paris Climate Accords, holding the Quad Summit, calling all of America's allies and reassuring them that America is back. These are corrections. Beyond these corrections, I think many of us who are watching Biden's foreign policy closely, we're still unsure as to what his foreign policy actually is. We're still unsure that beyond these corrections, what is the longer term plan of dealing with the China challenge? We're still unsure of how exactly they're going to knit together countries' support to deal with the climate challenge. I think a lot of these policies remain to be seen. My sense is, your phrase was leading from the front. I think Biden will shy one step away from leading from the front primarily because whatever Biden's views may be, leading from the front is no longer a popular thing to do in America. I think I said at the start that if you want to guess what Biden's going to do, try and look at what most Americans want. And my understanding of what most Americans want is American leadership, but leadership through talk and rhetoric and alliance building, but not leadership in terms of actually spending tons of money or getting mired in wars. So the leading from the front then, I would walk that back a little bit and position it somewhere between leading from the front and leading from behind.
Okay. Now, with suggestions to extend the Indo-Pacific to the east and to the west, and several European countries keen to be part of it, is it going to be an anchor of the new world order, as pointed out by Ram Madhav at an IAFA function a few days back? or this extending arc will propel China and Russia to come still closer and form a formidable challenge to the US hegemony?
I don't think China and Russia will come closer. I think the two have many differences. Remember, they're both led by leaders who are very old, who have amassed power for themselves in nearly unprecedented fashion. You know, Xi Jinping is the most powerful Chinese leader since Mao. He holds every top position imaginable, from the Politburo to being president to Communist Party chairman to commander of the army. Uh, you know, so it's hard to know beyond what he thinks how the Chinese feel. If something were to happen to him, then all bets are off in terms of broader Chinese alliances and policies. Same with Putin. Um, and I think both these countries and both these men, they kind of want to go it alone. I think there is not that much alignment in terms of their domestic goals or in terms of their foreign policy goals. So I'm not so sure they would come together to challenge US hegemony. I think between the two, it's far more likely that China alone will challenge US hegemony. I don't think China needs Russia to do anything, really. Um, and it wouldn't want to carry Russia along for the ride. Russia comes with all kinds of other historical baggage, with baggage in Eastern Europe, with baggage in the Middle East of getting mired in conflicts. That's just not the Chinese way. So I wouldn't go there. On the Indo-Pacific question, I don't think, I don't know that it will be an anchor for a new world order. You know, America has for the better part of 15 years talked a lot about pivoting to Asia. Something or the other has always happened. In the 2010s, it was the Arab Spring. Now it seems like it's China as a prominent challenge above and beyond all else. But there's also climate change, and a renewed focus on domestic policies for the United States. So again, if I were in the Indo-Pacific right now, I would be a little careful about how much the United States will invest in the Quad and the Indo-Pacific beyond what it is saying, because we've heard this talk before.
Okay. Now tell me, you have mentioned China so many times. China is emerging main challenge to US, and even the president, this one, Trump, has also publicly admitted he's a main rival. Now, so is the world, as your former colleague, your former boss, Fareed Zakaria says, world is entering a new Cold War. But in India, people like Shyam Saran dispute it. They think world is not really entering Cold War. What is your view?
I don't think we're there yet because, you know, the fundamental feature of the Cold War was two countries amassing, you know, world destructive arms against each other. And that's not quite what is happening with the United States and China. This is not about nuclear weapons. It is not about two competing, fundamentally opposing worldviews, as it were. I think it's a bit different than that. I think this is competing for influence. It is competing for economic power. It is competing for technological power. It is also competing for hearts and minds. I think it's a different challenge, not quite a Cold War, not quite as bipolar either as the Cold War was. I think, you know, what are the two poles with China and the United States? It's a little bit more fuzzy this time because, you know, one could say the American pole could be democracy and the Chinese pole is not that. But it's not like China is sort of, it is both communist and democratic in a sense, and in terms of what its people really want. So if you look at the end of the Cold War and how containment as a strategy accelerated the end of the Soviet Union, that's not a strategy that's going to work with China at all. I think China has a robust domestic economy. It is the biggest trading partner for more countries than America is now. Given that that's the case, I don't think the contours of a Cold War as a description work quite well for the China challenge. And I also think, one mustn't forget the US and China itself share immense amounts of trade with a lot of companies stationed in each other's domains, and a lot of cooperation on some fronts. So ultimately, we mustn't also forget that the United States is going to need China's cooperation when it comes to climate change, and for that reason, mostly, I don't think the Cold War framework applies as well theoretically to the US-China equation. I think it's very different, and it's also early days.
Now, Biden may not really admit publicly, but don't you think he has largely embraced Trump policy on China, Afghanistan with minor tweaking?
That's right. Of the two, Afghanistan is actually a little bit different because Trump at one point threatened to just pull all his troops out immediately. And he faced immense pushback from his generals at the time. If I'm not mistaken, I believe that's why Jim Mattis, the defense secretary at the time, ended up resigning. Biden is making no such threats. Biden has basically no good options in Afghanistan. You leave by May 1st and you essentially condemn Afghanistan to, a civil war internally. You don't leave and you face flack from the American population, which broadly, again, wants to end all US support for foreign wars. It's an unwinnable position, and I think Biden knows that. Deep down, I think Trump knew that as well. Trump maybe just cared less what happened next. China's the trickier one because you're right. I think there's broad acknowledgement now among the DC foreign policy community that in identifying and calling out China as the challenge that it is, I won't say threat so much, but the challenge that it is, the Trump administration may actually have done America a favor and may also have done the Biden administration a favor, because it now allows Biden to be tough on China without actually paying the consequences for it, because he can say, well, I'm only just following some of the policies that we have set in place. For example, in the waning days of the Trump administration, the US State Department came out and declared that what was happening in Xinjiang was a genocide, which is a very strong word to use, as you all know. Not only because, according to international law, branding something a genocide necessitates a response from the international community. And as our reporting showed, there was internal disputes within the State Department as to whether what is going on in Xinjiang constituted a genocide or not. There were many lawyers who said, no, it's actually not a genocide. It is crimes against humanity, which is bad, but a lesser designation in international law. By branding it a genocide, what the Trump administration has done is it has necessitated tough responses from the United States in the future, unless the US walks back that designation, which would then be another problem for them to deal with, because China would then say, look, the Americans say it is not a genocide. What's your problem? So, on China, it's tricky, it's murky. But one thing is clear. I think tougher rhetoric is here to stay. I think if you look at the recent meetings in Alaska, where Antony Blinken and Jake Sullivan met their Chinese counterparts, and there was, some angry words exchanged. A lot of that, I think, was posturing. I think a lot of it was speaking to a domestic audience. I think the Chinese officials were clearly trying to appear tough at home, especially the former foreign minister who was there, I believe Wang, who's educated in the United States, and it was very important for him to show that he wasn't too friendly to the Americans. So being tough was good for him. I think we're going to continue to see this, not just for this administration, but for the next decade or so. Much of it will be rhetorical, however. I don't think these are two sides that are spoiling for a fight.
Okay, I know that you have to chair a meeting after 15 minutes. I will quickly ask two questions, then maybe our attendees can ask few questions. The India-US relations are witnessing the best phase ever. Defense trade is booming, but the extraterritorial use of CAATSA can be a major sticking point unless the US grants a waiver. The US has emerged as India's second largest oil supplier after Iraq, replacing Saudi Arabia. But the bilateral trade and investment agreement is still elusive. Besides, the current Indian government is not going to take any criticism on human rights, Indian democracy lying down. It might strike back and point out the erosion of democratic values in the US. So shouldn't the US shun its preaching tone and adopt a more nuanced and practical approach to India?
So I don't think so, actually. I think it's very clear that the Biden administration is going to center human rights in all of its discourse. Look at how it came across as tough on Saudi Arabia by releasing and declassifying the document about the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. I think I would not be surprised if the United States continues that approach with other countries, including India. I think India will remain a really strong ally of the United States. But my hope is that, as I said earlier, admitting flaws and admitting weaknesses shows strength. I think that is a guiding principle of the Biden administration. I think they do not mind showcasing human rights issues in the United States because they see a discussion of flaws and a rectification of those flaws as a strength, not a weakness. And I imagine that is how they will back channel with India and with other countries by saying that, look, if we criticize you on these fronts, it is because we want you to do better. It is not because we want to show you down. It is not because we don't have these problems ourselves. My sense is that will be the discourse on the American side. The question is, how will New Delhi take it? How will New Delhi accept criticism or not? Certainly under the Trump administration, India was quite prickly at the faintest criticism. I think when Foreign Minister Jaishankar came to the US and refused to meet Pramila Jayapal, I think that shook the foreign policy community here a little bit because that showed a resistance to criticism that shows that India might be in a more defensive crouch than America would recommend. But all of this said, look, the preachy tone needs to go. I don't think you can criticize others in a preachy manner. I think America has to do it in a far more humble manner by saying, look, we have problems too. And it hasn't done that historically. That's a problem, and it needs to rectify that.
Okay, just 10 days back, Shashi Tharoor at one of our functions said, it's very good domain that a member of Indian diaspora is now in the striking distance of White House. Do you share his optimism?
I do. I mean, God forbid if something happens to President Biden, then Kamala Harris will be president. It is highly likely that although Biden just yesterday said it is his intention to run again, he has to say that, because if he doesn't say that, he's a lame
But then he
president.
said he respects fate. He also added he respects fate.
Exactly. So if we understand that he had to say he's going to run again to have an effective next 3 years, it's fairly likely he's not going to run again. And it's fairly likely that Kamala Harris will be the Democratic nominee in 2024. So yes, I mean, I think Shashi is absolutely right in saying an Indian American is within striking distance of being the next president of the United States. I think that's a matter of great pride for the Indian American community and also for India. I think the Indian American community, as you all know, is among the most prosperous diasporic groups in America. They have a median income of more than $100,000, which is higher than any other minority group in the United States. They are respected. They are increasingly entering public service and other very prominent domains. And I think that's a matter of pride for the diasporic community, but also a matter of pride for communities back home in South Asia.
Well, Ravi, you have been brilliant. You didn't duck any questions. You have really betted the state bet. I really admire it. Now, we have a couple of minutes. We will really open the floor. But first, let me greet two friends. One, Dr. Dennis Jorgens. He's director of Interest House, Chicago University. And we have Puneet Chopra from New York, who also went to Harvard University like yours. Now, we have among the attendees the senior-most person, Ambassador Eric Gonsalves. Now, he was in USA when I was not sure whether you were really born or not, if he's around there. Ambassador Gonsalves, are you there? I see you are still there.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
This
would you
time
like
I
to
think,
ask
yeah.
a question, Ravi? Sir,
Well, I don't have a question as such because
you
I think
you can make comment, brief comment.
I'll just make a couple of comments because I think that we are in an evolving situation in which the
Can you also press your video? We can see you. Okay, yes. Oh, yes, you are there.
No, I think that we are in an evolving situation, and I think that ultimately will have to move from the sort of hegemonic system, which in fact the Chinese have been asking for. I don't know whether you noticed that at the end of the Alaska summit, they said they would like to go back to the standard rules of the United Nations and so on. In other words, the elite, including China and the other P5, should run the world, which I think is what they would like to do. That I think is now beyond thing. I think that's what our foreign minister was trying to say in saying that there would have to be effectively a multipolar world and a more equal world, of course, with differences of level. And that is going to evolve, and I'm sure that all of you present, not us because I won't be here, will take part in giving more people access in the United States as you are in fact ending the white supremacy, and in India as we are trying to become more generalized, and all over the world. And in fact, as you've seen in Asia, it is not just the rise of China, because I think that China has, of course, done a superb job. But I think you've got to notice that there's also been Korea and Taiwan and now Vietnam and Indonesia and Bangladesh. I mean, let me mention Bangladesh because I think the Asian powers are beginning to be of count. And I think that we should notice this and think of this kind of new multipolar world. One. Two, I would just also say that hegemony is not only political, it's not only in governments. But you have all the, I mean, once upon a time it used to be the multinationals, now it's the great science and technology people who are trying to run the world and so on. And I think that these have to be also managed so that we get the best results of this for the entire world and to as many people as possible. And with this, I would leave that, that we give up the idea that we're going to be run by the P5, that we're going to be run by Davos, but we are going to have a much more equalized world. And I think Asia, and I hope that with some sense that Asia, including India, China, and South Asia and Southeast Asia, will be there to lead it.
Thank you, sir. We have among us the war veteran Major General Ramesh Chopra. Your audio is off. General Chopra, please unmute yourself.
Yeah. Can you
Yes,
hear me
yes.
now? Okay. All right. First, a very quick observation. Regardless of whether it's Biden or Trump or whoever it is, migrants are going to come to the States. I mean, I know I'm from the TCS, late 90s and early 21st century. Despite all the restrictions put, because of the MNCs, Indians were invited and we came. I don't want to talk about Mexico, etc. They will come whichever way they can. Okay, my comment come question. Both the chairman and the chief guest have spoken about Alaska. In my view, during the recent US China meet in Alaska, it seems the US was hedging with China talks with India ties, and they brought up its growing relationship with India. Now, expectedly, the Chinese side did not receive this well. I'm not talking of the loud bickering between the US and China. Now, talking of Quad, which all have mentioned, while India is expected to be the anchor in the Quad formulation as it is today, India, the foreign policy was discussed, and I want to ask you, Ravi, you talked about being a little worried when we talked about our foreign policy being strategic autonomy, multi-aligned with special relationship. And this is where the US comes in. If India wants to grow economically, technologically, we have to go to the US. We don't have any chance. And finally, on Quad, since you talked about expansion, I don't think the Quad is going to expand. The closest who can sort of come around in the arena is France. Non-controversial, lot of interest in the Indian Ocean. And as far as the Southeast Asian countries are concerned, besides Indonesia, which is showing reluctance, I can't see Vietnam and the others joining it. You might like to comment if you like. Thank you.
Well, do you want to say something, Ravi?
Yeah, these are great points. Thank you for your observations. With France, my only comeback on that is I think because China is the EU's greatest ally, the trading partner right now, I think it may face pressure from the Chinese to not formally align itself against China. And that also speaks to your point about Alaska. I think even now, China just doesn't like to hear that the Quad is an anti-China alliance. It likes to see it as, its own sort of group that has its interests, but it doesn't want to classify it as anti-China. I think European countries will struggle to get involved in an open way.
Well, Suresh, you can go ahead, ask the question very quick because he has to go in 3 minutes.
Thank you, Surendra. Very briefly, Joe Biden has made several overtures in different foreign policy speeches about getting back to traditional alliances across Atlantic. But the Europeans don't seem to have been really too warm in reciprocating to this gesture or these speeches. Why do you think so? Uncertainties or not trusting Joe Biden? What exactly is it? Thank you.
Ravi, this is last question. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's a great question. What I hear from Europeans all the time is they feel really burned by the last 4 years. And the thing they keep coming back to is the longer term. Whatever they do with Biden in the next 2 to 3 years, their fear is that Trump or Trumpism will return. And then they will be burned once again. And I think the problem is Biden has no way of reassuring them. He has no way of telling them that the Trump years were a blip. And part of the problem with the way in which the last election played out, and the fact that even when Biden took office, at that point, 3 out of 4 Republicans believed, according to polls, that the election was not free and fair. What this implies is that there's bound to be a return of Trumpism in some form, either through the midterms or at the next election. I think the Europeans know this, and they're going to be very cautious to, throw in their lot with Biden in a wholesome way. They're worried, and rightly so.
Ravi, before you go, can you just quickly tell whether Joe Biden really want to kill Putin?
I don't think so. I don't think so. Not his style. I think he called him a killer, which was, his way of using tough language and being tough. And of course, it invited a whole set of responses from the Russians. But this was posturing. It was rhetoric, as is to be expected.
Thank you very much, Ravi. You have been so great. 1 hour, 50 minutes. Let us give a big hand virtually to Ravi. Ravi, when you come to Delhi next time, do let me know. You have a friend here. Wish you good luck at the foreign policy. And I hope we will keep on getting good attention in the foreign policy, Indian affair. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for listening. Really, it's a wonderful forum that you have such a group of, experienced experts and practitioners. So it's a real honor to be able to speak to you. Thank you for listening. Thank you also for reading foreign policy. We really count on people like you to read us and share our work. So thank you, and I hope we can all stay in touch.
Thank you. Have a nice day, Ravi. Have a nice day.
Okay.
And thank you all for attending. Thank you. Bye-bye.